This story is not only a lesson in resilience, but also a powerful shock to the legal and justice system. When Naomi Carter, a high-ranking female military officer, was shot in a tense situation, the question kept ringing: why would a police officer be willing to pull a gun on someone who was trying to do a good deed for society? Why can prejudice about skin color lead to such a bad decision? Is this just an incident, or a sign of a larger problem within the police force? When the incident is exposed, Naomi not only faces physical pain, but also struggles to find justice, not only for herself, but for all those oppressed by racism. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to leave comments when listening to the story. Let's get started. Birds chirped through the trees as the sun rose above the horizon, painting the quiet neighborhood a golden yellow. Colonel Naomi Carter, a high-ranking military officer, had just returned from an international deployment after nearly 2 years away. The stress and danger of living abroad made her appreciate these peaceful mornings more than ever. She decided to maintain her daily jogging routine to clear her mind and stay healthy. Naomi wore a simple black tracksuit and old but sturdy running shoes. Her black hair was tied back, her face calm, but not hiding the toughness of someone who had experienced countless hardships on the battlefield. As she ran through the familiar residential area, she smiled and greeted a few neighbors, feeling everything was pleasant. But suddenly, an unusual sight caught her attention. Up ahead, at a house along the road, she saw a man in a dark coat fumbling in front of the door. He was bent over, looking around with a tense expression. Naomi immediately stopped, slowing down to take a closer look. She realized that the man had deliberately broken the door. His furtive actions and flustered appearance did not resemble that of a homeowner. Naomi quickly realized that she was witnessing a break-in. At that moment, the instincts of a seasoned soldier took over. Naomi did not hesitate. She immediately took out her phone to call the police, but before she could dial the number, a loud voice came from inside the house over the speaker. "I saw you on camera. The police are on their way. Get out of my house, you bastard!" The thief jerked, looking around. Naomi realized he was about to run away. Without hesitation, she began to chase after him. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice as firm and forceful as a military command. The thief turned to look at her, panic evident in his eyes. But instead of stopping, he ran as fast as he could down the empty street. Naomi quickly picked up the pace, following him. Even though she had been out of the military for several weeks, her rigorous training was still paying off. The man zigzagged through the aisles, trying to lose Naomi, but every time he looked back, she was right behind him, her steps strong and her determination unwavering. "I won't let you escape," Naomi growled, breathing evenly to conserve her strength. The thief, seeing that he could not escape the pursuit, frantically rummaged in his coat pocket and pulled out something shiny. Naomi immediately recognized it as a small knife. He turned around and ran, raising the knife as a warning. "Don't come any closer. I won't hesitate," he shouted, his voice filled with panic, but also a hint of defiance. Naomi paused for a moment, assessing the situation. She knew she couldn't be rash, but she couldn't let him get away. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for anything that could help. Luckily, a broken branch lay nearby. She bent down to pick it up, keeping a safe distance from him. "Put the knife down. The police are on their way. You can't escape," she said, her voice even and authoritative, trying to calm his nerves. The thief hesitated for a few seconds, his eyes wavering between Naomi and the road ahead. After a tense moment, he decided to take the risk and charge forward. Naomi quickly dodged to the side, using a tree branch to block his swing. The two men struggled in the middle of the street. Naomi, despite having no real weapon, had the upper hand thanks to her military training. She spun around and delivered a well-placed kick that sent the thief crashing to the ground. The thief staggered to his feet, but instead of resisting, he dropped the knife and continued running. Naomi was about to give chase again when she heard police sirens in the distance. She stopped, breathing heavily, feeling reassured that the police had arrived. She turned back to pick up the knife, intending to explain to the police what had just happened. But she did not know that a disastrous misunderstanding was waiting for her ahead. Naomi stood there panting, still clutching the small knife the thief had just thrown away. She looked around, trying to find traces of him in the alley, but his figure had completely disappeared. In that moment of silence, the sound of a police car siren broke the tense atmosphere. She breathed a sigh of relief, believing that the police would arrive in time to assist and quickly catch the thief. The patrol car stopped abruptly at the entrance to the alley. Two policemen got out, a tall man with a stern face and a small woman with sharp eyes. Leading the way was Officer Mark Reynolds, who was known in the area for his toughness and sometimes his impatience in tense situations. Mark walked quickly towards Naomi, one hand on the gun hilt at his hip, his eyes filled with suspicion. "Put the knife down and put your hands up," he shouted, his voice firm, brooking no resistance. Naomi was taken aback by his attitude. She looked down at the knife in her hand in confusion, quickly raising her hands, thinking that she needed to explain quickly. "Wait, I'm not a bad guy," she said, her voice calm but clear. "I was just trying to stop a thief. He ran off in the other direction." Mark didn't care for the explanation. His eyes locked on Naomi. Then he quickly assessed the situation. A black woman in sweats, holding a knife at the scene of a break-in. His preconceptions were instantly confirmed. "I'm not asking why. Put the knife down and get on the ground," Mark shouted again, his hand starting to pull the gun from its holster. The female police officer standing behind, Officer Julie Harris, seemed hesitant, her eyes glancing over Naomi, as if sensing something was wrong with the way her partner was handling things. Naomi slowly placed the knife on the ground, holding her hands high above her head to show that she was not threatening. "Listen, I'm Colonel Naomi Carter, United States Army," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not an intruder. The thief ran away, and I tried to catch him." Mark smirked. "Colonel? Wow, that's impressive. But do you expect me to believe that? You look like a military officer, especially in that tracksuit." The sarcasm and veiled innuendo made Naomi feel uncomfortable, but she tried to keep her composure. "If you let me take my wallet from my pocket, I can prove it. I carry identification," Naomi said, gesturing to the small bag slung around her waist. Mark immediately took a step back, his gun pointed straight at Naomi. "Don't move. Do you think I'm stupid? Are you trying to get something out of your pocket to attack me? Keep your hands above your head." Naomi began to realize that this situation was not simple. She tried to keep her voice calm. "I didn't mean to attack you. I just wanted to explain better." Julie, standing behind, looked hesitant. She whispered to Mark, "Hey, maybe she's telling the truth. She doesn't look like a thief." But Mark ignored it, his eyes still filled with doubt and prejudice. "I've dealt with dozens of cases like this, Julie. She might be trying to throw us off track. Don't be fooled." Mark stepped forward, gun still pointed at Naomi. "I won't say it again. Kneel down and put your hands behind your head." Naomi took a deep breath, feeling her frustration rising. She was used to facing dangerous situations, but she never thought she would be treated like this in the very country she had dedicated her life to protecting. "Look, I don't mean to be confrontational," she said, her eyes fixed on Mark. "But you're making a big mistake." "A mistake?" Mark laughed, his voice filled with contempt. "You think I don't know how to do things? I've seen this situation 100 times. Naomi had no choice but to comply. She slowly knelt down on the ground, feeling humiliated and helpless. She couldn't believe that just because of the color of her skin and the way she dressed, she was being treated like a criminal while trying to help others. Julie stood behind, her eyes wavering between Mark and Naomi. She felt that something was wrong with the way Mark handled things, but hesitated to directly object. Naomi knelt on the ground, her hands behind her head as requested, but inside, her restraint began to crack. As a high-ranking officer in the military, she was used to commanding, controlling situations, and being respected. Now, she was being treated like a dangerous criminal, all because of prejudices she could not control. Mark approached her, gun still pointed at her, eyes full of suspicion. "Now, you will stand up very slowly, and I will handcuff you. Any other move, I will consider it an act of resistance." Naomi looked up at him, her eyes blazing with rebellion. "I'm not a thief, and I don't need to be handcuffed. I've made it clear I'm Colonel Naomi Carter of the United States Army. Check my pockets, you'll find the papers to prove it." But Mark wasn't listening. "Colonel or not, this is a crime scene, and I don't have time to listen to your stories. Get up, or I will be forced to use force." Naomi tried to keep calm, but she knew things were going wrong. She had faced much more stressful situations on the battlefield, but this brought a different kind of humiliation. Julia, the police officer standing behind, began to speak, her voice a little hesitant. "Mark, maybe we should check what she said. If she has papers in her bag, maybe." "Shut up, Julie," Mark snapped, cutting his teammate off. "You're always so soft. Do you know how many times I've heard excuses like that?" Naomi couldn't take it anymore. She gritted her teeth, trying to maintain the toughness she always carried in every situation. "I'm warning you, if you continue to behave like this, there will be consequences. I'm not someone you can treat with such disrespect." Mark laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "You're threatening me? That's ridiculous. Now stand up right now." When Naomi didn't move, Mark decided to act. He stepped forward and grabbed her hand to pull her up, but Naomi, with her years of self-defense instincts, reacted immediately. She turned around, knocking Mark's hand away from her. "Don't touch me!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the narrow alley. Naomi's actions made Mark angry. "That's resisting a law enforcement officer. Do you believe I'll shoot you?" Julie, seeing this scene, hurried over. "Mark, calm down! We don't need guns!" Julie shouted, trying to calm the situation, but Mark didn't listen. He was consumed by prejudice and anger. He looked at Naomi as if she were the greatest threat he had ever faced, even though the reality was completely different. At this moment, Naomi was about to put her hand in her pocket to get her personal papers to prove her identity and end this unnecessary conflict. Mark took another step, the gun still pointed at her. "Get down on the ground, now!" "Mark, stop! We need to wait for the captain to get here." Julie continued to dissuade, her eyes filled with worry as she saw the situation getting out of control. But before Julie could do anything more, a gunshot rang out through the air. Naomi felt a sharp pain in her left leg. She fell to the ground, falling to one knee as pain spread throughout her body. Julia screamed in horror. "Mark, what did you just do?" Mark stepped back, eyes wide, but trying to keep a stoic expression. "She's resisting. I'm just doing my job." Naomi gritted her teeth, trying not to let the pain overwhelm her. She looked straight at Mark, her eyes filled with anger and frustration. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice low and cold as a verdict. The sound of a car horn echoed through the alley, cutting through the tense atmosphere. A large police car with flashing lights stopped at the entrance of the alley. The car door opened and Chief James Whitman stepped out. He was a man in his 50s, muscular, but with a face that showed authority mixed with the fatigue brought by many years in the profession. He saw the scene. Naomi was lying on the ground, her arms wrapped around her bleeding leg. Julie was bending over her, trying to stop the bleeding, while Mark stood nearby, gun still in hand, his expression tense but not without smugness. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew he had to handle this situation tactfully, but his instincts told him something was very wrong. He walked towards Mark, his voice strong. "Mark, what's going on here?" Mark turned, quickly holstering his gun. He straightened, his expression trying to remain professional. "Sir, I caught this suspect fleeing the scene of a break-in. She refused to comply with my commands and resisted, forcing me to fire to ensure her safety." James raised his eyebrows, looking at Mark seriously. "Suspect? Is it her?" He turned to look at Naomi. Despite the pain from her wound, she maintained a firm and proud demeanor. She looked up, her eyes meeting James's. In that moment, he recognized her. "Wait." James paused, his voice slow but steady. "This is Colonel Naomi Carter, right?" "Colonel Carter, what are you doing here?" Naomi, though her face was pale with pain, struggled to speak. "Thank you for recognizing me, Sheriff. I was jogging and saw someone trying to break into our house. I chased him, but when the police got here, they thought I was the burglar." James narrowed his eyes and turned to look at Mark, anger slowly showing on his face. "Mark, did you check her identity before deciding to use force?" Mark stammered, but still tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, she is not cooperating and you think shooting her was the right thing to do," James shouted, cutting Mark off. "Do you know who she is? Colonel Naomi Carter is a military hero. Not only did she defend this country, but she was a Medal of Honor recipient, and you shot her just because you didn't believe her." Mark was speechless, his face pale. Julie, now standing up from Naomi's position, hastily interjected, "Sheriff, I tried to stop her, but Mark wouldn't listen to me. She tried to explain, but Mark—" James held up a hand to silence Julie. He turned back, crouching beside Naomi, his eyes softening. "Colonel Carter, I sincerely apologize for my subordinate's actions. I assure you that he will be held accountable for this. We need to get you to the hospital immediately." Naomi looked at James, the anger still there, but she nodded slightly. "Thank you, Sheriff, but I will not let this stop here. His abuse of power and prejudice must be dealt with properly." James nodded, his eyes solemn. "I understand, and you are absolutely within your rights. I will personally report this incident and ensure that justice is served." He quickly pulled out his walkie-talkie and ordered the ambulance to come immediately. Mark stood still, his face blank. He knew his career was probably over, but James wouldn't let him go. "Mark, you are suspended immediately. Turn in your weapon and badge." Mark tried to protest. "But sir, I'm just following procedure," James shouted loudly, his voice full of authority. "Procedure? What procedure allows you to shoot an unarmed person without checking his identity? Are you talking about procedure or just your own prejudice?" Mark had nothing more to say. He removed his gun and badge, handing them to James with trembling hands. The ambulance arrived quickly. Naomi was lifted onto a stretcher, but before she was taken away, she turned back to look at Mark, her eyes cold. "I have dedicated my life to protecting people like you, but today you shot the one person you were supposed to protect. Remember that." Mark couldn't respond, just stood there, paralyzed. James, at this moment, turned to look at him again, his voice low and filled with indignation. "I hope you're willing to pay for what you've done." The military hospital was always a busy place, but tonight it seemed even more chaotic as Colonel Naomi Carter was wheeled in. The stretcher rolled through the hallway at a rapid pace, the medical team following her, checking her leg constantly. Naomi kept her face calm, though the sharp pain from the bullet wound made her forehead bead with sweat. Sheriff James Whitman walked beside her, his face full of concern. When the stretcher stopped in front of the operating room, he put a reassuring hand on Naomi's shoulder. "Colonel Carter, I have notified the hospital's best medical staff. You will be taken care of. I will be here until everything is settled." Naomi looked up at him, her eyes serious, but not without weariness. "Thank you, Chief. But I want to make sure that your subordinates' actions are not overlooked. Such prejudice and abuse of power cannot continue." James nodded firmly. "I promise you, this case will be thoroughly handled. He will be held responsible before the law and the community." The operating room door closed, leaving James standing outside with a heavy feeling. He sighed, turning towards the waiting area. In the waiting room, some of Naomi's colleagues from the military had arrived. They were all in uniform, their faces filled with worry. A tall man, wearing the insignia of a lieutenant colonel, walked towards James. "Sheriff Whitman, this is Lieutenant Colonel Harris. Naomi is my longtime partner. We heard about the incident. What's going on?" James, still keeping his tone calm but serious, briefly explained the situation. Harris heard it, clenched his fists, his eyes filled with anger. "She deserves to be treated with the utmost respect. I can't believe this happened. We will get justice for her." James nodded. "I completely agree. This is a serious mistake by someone under my command, and I will not tolerate it." About an hour later, the doctor walked out of the operating room. He was a middle-aged man with grey hair and a gentle but stern expression. "Colonel Carter is out of danger. The bullet did not cause serious damage to the bones, but she will need time to recover. She is currently being transferred to the recovery room." A sigh of relief spread throughout the waiting room. James nodded his thanks to the doctor, then turned back to look at Harris. "I'll see her as soon as she wakes up. Thank you and your teammates for coming. This is the time she needs support the most." Harris put his hand on James's shoulder, his eyes sincere. "Thank you, Sheriff. I hope we can work together to clear this up and bring justice to Naomi." James just nodded. Inside him, a feeling of guilt and responsibility grew. Immediately after the incident, it quickly became a national issue. The media could not ignore the story of a female military officer shot by a police officer because of racism and abuse of power. The name of Naomi Carter, a colonel in the army, became the focus of the press. The image of her lying on a stretcher, seriously injured, holding her leg in pain, made many people angry and feel indignant. Meanwhile, the actions of the police officer Mark Reynolds, who shot her without justification, made the public even more indignant. The next morning's news was filled with sensational headlines. "Cops shoot female army officer over racism." "Unprecedented police brutality." "Police lose trust." "Mark Reynolds' absurd action." Human rights organizations, anti-racism groups, and even social media celebrities were quick to denounce Mark's actions. "We cannot allow those in power to abuse and torture innocent people like this, especially when they are defenders of our country like Colonel Carter," a Black Lives Matter spokesperson declared at a protest held in front of the city's police headquarters. Soon after, protests erupted in major cities across the United States. Black rights groups marched to demand justice for Naomi Carter and to hold Mark Reynolds accountable. There were also protests outside the police station where Mark worked, with signs calling for his suspension and dismissal. The protests were not limited to police departments or human rights groups. The incident also attracted the attention of government agencies. Lawmakers from both the Democratic and Republican parties condemned Mark's actions, calling it a prime example of racial discrimination in policing. Emergency meetings were held in Congress to discuss police abuses and how to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Meanwhile, Naomi's family continues to receive support from fellow military members. They are not only concerned for Naomi's well-being, but are also speaking out strongly for justice in the handling of this case. They have even called for a federal investigation, concerned that racism in the police force has led to Naomi being the victim of unjustified violence. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, quickly got involved, opening a formal investigation into Mark Reynolds' actions. A provisional arrest warrant was issued for him shortly after the investigation was launched. Mark was charged with abuse of power, causing serious bodily injury and racially charged conduct. The FBI began collecting evidence from the scene, including surveillance cameras in the area, witness statements, and information related to Mark's work record. Investigators interviewed Julie, the only co-worker who witnessed the entire incident, and others who were at the scene. Video footage of the confrontation between Naomi and Mark also became an important part of the case file, further weakening Mark's defense. With all the evidence and strong public opposition, the investigation quickly came to a conclusion. Mark Reynolds had abused his power by using excessive force and without reasonable grounds. However, what made the investigation even more complicated was the element of racism. Mark had shown contempt for Naomi from the beginning, refusing to believe her explanation because of her skin color. This was a factor that could not be ignored in the trial process. With the FBI confirming the charges, Mark Reynolds was charged with serious charges, including abuse of power, shooting Naomi when she was unarmed and posed no apparent threat was a violation of police use of force rules. Serious injuries. The bullet wound to Naomi's leg required emergency surgery and could take months to fully recover. Racism in public service. Investigations have shown that Mark acted with racial bias, not only in his treatment of Naomi, but also in his attitude and words before the incident occurred. The case not only affected Mark's career, but also became a milestone in the fight against racism in law enforcement agencies. The indictment received widespread support from the community, and human rights organizations pledged to follow this case to the end, ensuring that justice is served in the fairest way. At this point, not only Naomi, but the community and the government expect a fair outcome, a clear sign that wrongdoings like Mark Reynolds's will not be overlooked. The day of the trial of Mark Reynolds, the police officer accused of abuse of power and racism, finally arrived. The public and the media were paying close attention, as this was a momentous case that not only touched on the power of the police, but also reflected the changing way society viewed and dealt with racism in law enforcement. Naomi Carter, still in pain from her injuries, decided to appear in court as a witness to tell her story, knowing that her voice would be an important factor in bringing justice. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds appeared in court, looking nervous. He tried to maintain his composure, but the anxious look in his eyes and the signs of stress on his face showed that he knew things were not as easy as he thought. Charged with abuse of power and racial discrimination, Mark faced a serious sentence. The prosecution prepared a series of evidence, including surveillance video, witness statements, and especially medical evidence that showed the severity of Naomi's injuries. When the trial began, Naomi was the first witness called. She stepped up to the stand, still limping from her leg injury, but her eyes were strong and determined. She began to recount the details of what had happened that day. Naomi's voice rang out in the courtroom, clear and strong, causing the entire room to fall silent. "It was a normal day like any other," Naomi began. "I was jogging when I saw a man breaking into a house. The homeowner wasn't there, but I knew he was doing something bad, so I decided to run after him to stop him. When I got closer, I realized he was a burglar breaking into a house. I immediately called the police, but I didn't expect that as I chased the burglar, I would become the target of a police officer." She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm herself. All eyes in the room were on her. When the police arrived, I explained the situation, saying that I was a military officer and was on duty. But he didn't believe me. Not only did he not listen to my explanation, he also unreasonably restrained me. When I tried to explain my identity, he shook his head and said that I was just a black man trying to get away with it. The courtroom fell silent as Naomi described the racial abuse she endured. She continued to describe how Mark did not stop, despite her best efforts to explain that she was a colonel in the army. Naomi's testimony further clarified the nature of Mark's behavior. He wouldn't even listen to me, and when I tried to explain again, he pulled out a gun and shot me in the leg. At this moment, Naomi could not hold back her emotions, her eyes filled with tears. I am not a criminal. I was just doing my job, stopping crime. But he wouldn't let me explain. I don't know why he did that. But I know that racism made him see me as nothing more than a criminal. Naomi's testimony moved many in the courtroom. She had been through both physical and mental pain, and all she wanted was justice. Next, other witnesses were called to the stand. One of them was Julie, Mark's co-worker. Julie witnessed the scene when Mark pulled out a gun and shot Naomi. She recounted that as soon as the police arrived, Naomi tried to explain and cooperate, but Mark completely ignored her and acted violently. Julie felt ashamed when she witnessed Mark's behavior, and she also confirmed that Mark had a clear racist attitude towards Naomi. Surveillance video footage was also shown in court. It captured the entire incident from Naomi chasing the thief until Mark pulled out a gun and shot her. Every detail showed that Naomi was not acting in any way threatening to the police, but was simply trying to cooperate in stopping the crime. The prosecution, with all the evidence, concluded that Mark Reynolds had seriously abused his power and acted in a racist manner. Shooting Naomi without just cause was an unforgivable act, especially when she was a law enforcement officer and had no intention of causing harm. The defense offered by Mark's lawyers was a weak one. They tried to blame Mark's stress and efforts in a dangerous situation, but clearly those reasons could not justify his unreasonable actions. After all sides had spoken, the jury returned its verdict. Mark Reynolds was sentenced to 15 years in prison for abuse of power, causing grievous bodily harm and racially insensitive conduct. This was a strong sentence that sent a clear message that violence and racism will not be tolerated in society. As the verdict was announced, a sense of justice filled the courtroom. Naomi looked up, feeling comforted even though the wound on her leg was still raw. She knew this was not just a personal victory, but a victory for those who fight for justice, for those oppressed and undervalued because of the color of their skin. After the trial, Naomi's life never fully returned to normal. Although her physical wounds had healed, the emotional effects of the event continued to haunt her. However, instead of letting those painful memories break her, Naomi chose to use them as motivation. She continued her work with the same passion and dedication, but now, every day, was a fight for justice and equality. The incident made Naomi an icon for victims of racism and injustice. She was invited to many social forums where she shared her story and affirmed that no one, regardless of status, has the right to look down on or hurt others just because of their skin color, gender, or background. She joined organizations and campaigns to fight for the rights of oppressed people, especially in the police and military, where discrimination and injustice are often witnessed. One of the most important changes for Naomi is her determination to promote respectful and non-racist training programs in the military and law enforcement. She believes that changing the mindset and perspective of individuals within these organizations will make a huge difference in not only reducing similar incidents, but also creating a fairer and safer work environment for everyone. Thank you for listening to this meaningful story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, to leave a comment with your feelings when listening to the story. Wish you always happy.